Hello? I love you guys. Hi. we would want to change the relationship. Yeah. What can I say? Okay, thank you. Thank you for your good questions. Hi, Sarah. Nice to see you too. You look vaguely familiar. Yeah, that's right. Mhm. Well, I liked your question, and I know why you're asking it because I know the context you're coming from in Reno. I answered it not mindfulness per se, and let me explain what I mean by that. Um, I think I think sometimes when we're talking about mindfulness, it can become more than just what it is. Mindfulness is one of many things, and in point of fact, it's not necessarily part of the core piece. I mean, it is part of ACT. We do have mindfulness exercises, but um, mindfulness per se and teaching them how to be mindful, I think didn't necessarily account for the ability to tact as well as some of the other things that are created by this sort of FAP enhanced ACT feedback rich environment whereby you're sitting with somebody and you are talking about mattering and what you matter about, and it's sort of like my amalgam of fappish actish. I talk to them about like a matterometer and I draw it on the wall like a big thing, and I've got like a little arrow, and they have like a matterometer and they talk about things that they care about, and then I blend that in with, okay, well, those are things that you value, because you kind of have to have an educative piece about what values are. And so as they're learning about what matters to them and how they matter about others, and you have this feedback rich environment where they talk to you about what's mattering to them and what's going on in the actual interplay between you and the client, I see that insight crops up there, and the ability to tact what they're thinking, feeling, doing is much more about that context than about any sort of technique that I can throw at them, like a mindfulness exercise. Now, does a mindfulness exercise help individuals become more centered and to understand that self as context plays and to reduce stress? Yes, I mean, it has that ancillary benefit as well. But I think that the tacting repertoire, when it emerges, is much more about the context and not about just some techniques. So I hope that makes sense. But absolutely, absolutely. It's just a huge focus. There's a lot of research about experiential feedback. I think Steve and Marcia and Rosenfarb in '89 did a study on experiential feedback in a feedback-rich environment from an experiential focus is going to dramatically increase the likelihood that the individual can move forward in terms of learning and growing. And so uh, I can't say anything more about it. The more concrete it is, the more physicalized it is, the more willing the person is. And they seem to be more interesting and engaged, and not just with this population. So, you guys just froze on me. I'm not sure. Just, am I still moving? Oh, there you are. Now you're moving. Okay, good. Hi. Oh, sure. Are you, so you're asking if, do I think that coming from an ACT stance increases the likelihood that I can connect with this population?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes. And let me tell you why in a very concrete way. One of the very core beginning parts of the very beginning ACT protocol was the two mountains metaphor. Are you aware of that metaphor? Yeah. So when I sit down with individuals with a disability, I have noticed, and anyone who comes in for therapy, I mean, you know, there's a level of anxiety. They're going to share with you their psychological swamp, and you're going to walk into it with them. But these are individuals who have an extra layer of anxiety. They may be there with caregivers, family. There's been possibly stigma. Maybe they don't even know why they're there. They may feel punished. There's all kinds of extra layers on the onion, right? And so I usually just draw on the wall the two mountains, and I draw them and I draw me, and I say, I'm not trying to be higher up on my mountain, and I'm not thinking that you're like lower on yours, and I'm not this some fixed person, because believe me, I'm not, and you're not the broken one. But what I have is perspective. You're over there clinging to your mountain, I'm clinging to mine, and what maybe I might be able to offer you is I can look over and see. And that seems to across populations, and it's one thing from the original ACT protocol that I use with every client I see. There's no one who sits in front of me that I don't say that to in some version or another. But in this population, it seems to have a particular, they're particularly sensitive to these sorts of things, and it seems to level the playing field. Now, I do go out of my way to be, I feel that I'm a little more animated than maybe I would normally. I tend to talk with my hands, and I'm pretty animated anyway, but I do a little bit more exaggeration, and in line with a fappishness, with FAP, when clients are doing things that you're less kind of, that you're a little cranky with, you're more likely to be, you know, you give them facial feedback where you're looking away and you're kind of ignoring, you know, if they're doing stuff, they're ranting, you're just, you know, there are times I've actually left the room. I put a plant in a chair once, not with an intellectually disabled person. I was like, when you're ready to talk with me instead of at me, I'll be back. But I mean, and that made a point, right? That was a FAP moment with that client, and that individual understood that, you know, because me ignoring him didn't, the feedback, the level of feedback, I couldn't reach that person, so I had to leave the room, and that you know, that got the level of feedback. But these are individuals who you have to gauge that. Where is that feedback bar? Where are they able to read the feedback that you're giving them? Are they reading your facial expressions? And if they are at all sensitive to it, then you can modify what you're doing. And, you know, and I tend to be very, you know, if they talk about thoughts and feelings in any way, I'm very there. And like, you know, I want to know about it because I want to very much encourage that they know this is a bubble where they can be safe. And so I do different things, I think. But at the same time, I try to make it as much like traditional psychotherapy with my other clients, because I don't believe in lowballing anybody for any reason, period. I mean, they're there, they may have some limitations, but they're as abled as the rest of us in all sorts of ways, and they're certainly abled enough to be suffering in the same way that any one of us could be. So I think it's a mistake to do anything except just meet them where they're at. And that's what I tell my students when we're going through supervision with any client. Figure out where they're at, and I have them kind of doing like a virtual reality case conceptualization in front of them. You know, we're tracking like clinically relevant behaviors and what kind of treatment targets, and I really want them to be having that case conceptualization up there in a virtual reality kind of a way, and just trying to hit those targets in a feedback-rich way. And so far it seems to have utility. It's got face validity. It's fun. So, but yeah, I hope that answers your question. But yeah, yeah. Hi. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Are we normal? Are we not? I give us to graduate from the PhD program at Reno. I mean, come on. We're normal in our way, I guess. We're Reno-esque. Okay, let me tell you what I think about that, because I've done quite a bit of thinking while I was there, because I sat on both teams, and as is traditional in Steve's lab, I took my own sweet time getting through there. I was there for 8 years, and so I had the privilege to sit on the ACT and FAP teams for, I think it was almost it was almost 7 years between, the whole time. So, and I sat on DBT as well, but it was less kind of where I'm at. And over the years, it came to feel really strongly first that having that FAP component with especially access to individuals, which became my specialty. I really enjoy working with not necessarily borderline folks, but other individuals like kind of schizoaffective, schizotypal, narcissistic, those types of folks, people who lack insight into the function of their behavior on others. That's very interesting to me. Asperger's type stuff. So I started there, and really these were folks who would come in the room and lack a lot of insight in general about how they functioned on others. They would come in and be screaming about how they keep getting fired and they don't have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and they're angry, and there was a lot of righteous indignation and zero insight about how that functions on others. And to start in with ACT and talking about values, that didn't feel like the first foot forward. Putting the first foot forward and talking about workability and this change effort and how it's not working for them did. And so kind of a more traditional ACT-y kind of a first foot forward, like the creative hopelessness stuff. But I started kind of having FAP be my second chair in there, where we talk about past change efforts and talk about how their current life was functioning, and they would want to leave the room on stories, go off on a story, basically. And I mean, leave the room metaphorically, okay, well, my week, blah, blah. No, I don't want to talk about the fire of the week. I want to talk about patterns in your life that are a lot like this. No, because of these access to spectrum-y issues. And so I found that kind of gently kind of fapping, it's like bam, 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 hammering it, like, you want them pecking right there, right? Not to talk like a freaky behaviorist, but I mean, you guys get it. I can say this to you guys, right? Like, they're pecking over here, right? They're talking righteously indignated, my boss, blah, 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 without any insight whatsoever. And so you're like, shape, 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 shape. And it's very much like, on one hand, you're saying, gosh, these past change efforts are really getting in your way, and I'm wondering about the utility of them. And then they're like, yeah, well, my boss, boom. So you sort of fap that. Gosh, so you'd have that fap moment of like, well, gosh, I really want to talk. I'm feeling not so close to you because we're not talking about today. Let's stay in today, So what about those change efforts? Blah, blah, talk about change efforts. Then boom, they're off somewhere else. Boom, you fap it back in. So it just became this thing that became really natural. So you're right. I pretty much don't practice straight FAP or straight ACT at all. I have my own version of Julieann's FAP, and I don't call it FACT. It's just my FAP Enhanced ACT. My core is I'm an ACTie. I mean, I'm a Steve Hayes Labby at my heart. But I do believe that there is some pieces of being able to create that bubble and say, okay, I can't talk to you about values if you're busy righteously indicated over here, and I need you to stay with me right here. And that very contingent responding, boom, boom. So how does that work with people with disabilities? Well, individuals with disabilities are not necessarily coming in with those types of lack of insight because of personality disorders, but topographically it can look the same. They come in with lack of insight, but it's because of cognitive limitations or because no one has ever talked to them in this way before. It's not from their inability, and you wouldn't want to assume that they can't understand it, but maybe nobody's ever said anything about an insight-oriented, or even doing a mini little functional analysis or chain analysis of why do you even do this, and how does this work for you, and how is it functioning for you, and what is your past patterns. And so it's kind of slipped its way in that way, and it became like clinically where I feel at home. And I know that you know this too. You find where you are, who you are as a clinician, and it just started to work. And it works for me with this population in terms of being able to give them that really direct contingent feedback. And to a lot of FAP is about saying, I feel this way, and that's in ACT as well. There's self-disclosure moments in punctuated important times, but with FAP I can say, like if they're looking at the ground, I can say, okay, wait a minute, whoa, I need you to look right at me, eye contact, it's really important to me. So let's still keep talking about that history of change efforts that, what have you done? So I'm not saying that it's either one or the other, it's literally blended in every other sentence. I try to weave it together. Not sure how successful I am, but I try. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. It's funny you should ask that. I was just yesterday. Here's my sticky notes. Here's my proof. I was just sitting here. I wrote the word resistance down, and I've been trying to work out in my mind what I think resistance on a principle level is in terms of is it well with different populations. And I really think you're going to hate this answer, okay? Because it's not at all sciencey. And actually, I remember Alan Frusetti telling me, I don't want to hear you say that, but I really think, because it was with a DBT client that I was really clicking with, and he asked me how I was getting through to this resistant client. And he said, no one else will deal with this person. And I said, I really think it's like the force of my personality, like in my willingness and my earnestness. And he didn't want to hear that at all. He wanted to hear something more sciencey. But the more I think about it, I really do believe that it's about, and with these folks too, going in, one down, being honest, being humble, being right there with them, and being willing to say, you know what, I'm a little freaked out right now, or can we just slow down a little bit? I'm not sure how I'm feeling. And just being a real human being and just being as transparent as you can be in session as a human being, and still maintain the therapeutic posture, obviously. It's just, I think, I don't have a lot of problems with resistance, and that's why I wrote it down on this, because I got asked that question here the other day. I'm, getting supervised for my hours for my licensure, and my supervisor said, you have like this zero no-call, no-show rate, and like everyone comes to you, and why don't you have resistance? And I was like, well, I don't know. And I think there's something about this treatment technology. Okay, there's something about coming in there from an ACT stance and really believing, with a little b, not big B, obviously, but just coming in there and being real and earnest and being transparent. I really truly believe that. I think if you're there and you're real and you're honest, then resistance can go down. Now, are some people just cranky? Sure, but I've found that that's where your personality can come in. And I just worked, for a year in the VA system, and some of these guys are, pretty cranky Vietnam War era vets and not happy. And I was very irreverent. They would say, I feel like killing myself. I'd say, you know what, me too. Just if you feel like that, you have to gauge it. You know what I'm saying? As a clinician, you can't just go in there and be some, you have to, I'm babbling, but I really believe that you start to get a sense of like, it's like music and it's like dancing, and you're in there and you're gauging it and you're seeing where they're at. And if they're resistant, there are ways for you to get around it. Like, say, there was one a giggling adolescent, and I got up and I left. Then I came back and I pulled out my cell phone and I started like texting someone. And finally she stopped giggling and she said, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, I was just waiting to talk to you. What are you doing?" She goes, "Oh, you're different." Okay. Well, yeah, I am different, but I'm not going to talk to you if you're going to sit and giggle and be. So it's sort of this fappishness where you give this very heavy, rich in feedback, and then you also this whole mattering thing about, this is my values to be here for you, and I know you've got hard stuff, and I want to walk out there with you. The real ACT stuff about being humble and being right there. I mean, you're in a unique position in Reno to be coming out of that type of training, and I wouldn't trade mine for the world. You're very welcome. And didn't you ask this other question about verbal behavior? Yes, no? Yeah. Yeah. You had asked, are there situations where clients can interact just with one component yet cannot interact at another level necessary? And yeah, that's a good question. I answered yes, because a lot of our folks in this population are the fusion stuff is a real toughie because of the verbal limitations. And so I thought that was a good question. I just wanted to make sure that I got to address it. You're welcome. Nice. Nice. Thank you, Steve. Oh, I have stories. Right. Right. Yes. Right. Yes. Well, um, yeah, I think you're right. I think that we coming at it from, like I said, coming at it from the Reno world, I think I answered one of my questions that way. We're sort of uniquely situated to be able to understand the spectrum in this way. But when I work with folks who are just looking at DD from a BA sensibility, a lot of times I find that I can bridge it. Not only, I mean, obviously I have to be able to speak the language, and that's number one. I mean, a lot of clinical psychologists in our field that don't come from our program, they don't, not only do they not speak the language, they don't even want to speak it. They don't even understand what radical behaviorism or contextual functionalism, any of it, nor do they want to. So part of it, I think, is going to have to be, if we really want to bridge that beyond just folks from Reno doing this, is clinical psychologists taking the onus on themselves to be able to even speak the language of and being able to talk. Because I feel like one of the ways that I make inroads is I know that things, I know certain hot buttons that they're interested in. For example, there is a bridge. If I talk about rigidity in responding, if I talk about things like um, um, someone who is this insensitivity, which folks then be able to talk about this imperviousness to feedback. Well, this is what we talk about in FAP or in ACT, but these are what they're worried about in real world, because these are people living in supported living arrangements who keep doing things that keep acting out in challenging ways. And so they're worried about creating behavioral plans to reduce uh, these types of rigidity and respond, these types of things. So I feel like that one way is through language and also through caring about the same things, because what I found is that they don't think that I care about the same stuff. They don't think that I even am talking the same language or even know that these are targets. They think, oh, well, that we're psychologists and we just deal with depression or anxiety. But when I talk to them about more principle level things, and that I'm not necessarily interested in topographies, and I can do a functional analysis and get to the bottom of it, I seem to get there. So I guess the first part of my answer is being able to speak the language and caring about those type of variables. But do I think, how do I know? I don't know how to make that possible, Steve. I really don't. I don't know. course. Yeah, no, I understand. Right. Well, the only thing that comes to mind is just from various conversations I've had with folks in that area before, and like I said, being able to speak the language is part of it, but picking out content areas that they care about. For example, self-injury. I mean, this is something that people who are clinical psychologists who don't necessarily they're concerned about self-injury too. So when I pick out a content area, and I don't even have to use fancy behavioral language to discuss, hey, your client with mild mental retardation is they're hurting themselves, they're banging their head. It seems to me when I talk about various content areas, sometimes they want to listen to me. But how do I break in on like, I'm not going to say that people are prejudicial and think, well, just because I have a degree in clinical that I don't know about BA, but it's more like this entrenched idea that, well, behavior modification has its place and its strengths, and why would you even want to try that? So it's almost like fighting an ideological battle, and I even have to convince somebody that I might have some merit. Mm-hmm. Absolutely not. And in fact, I well, and I want caregivers to be able to do it as well. I mean, that's my ultimate thing, is that caregivers would that this would be part of what they do. That they say, oh, okay, instead of me, because I've seen caregivers do all kinds of things. Put people in timeout. I mean, take away their stuff. I mean, just this sort of weird, gross, grotesque kind of pseudo parenting, yucky stuff that they've tried to intervene. It's not. This is folks that if they, and there's nothing in there. This is meant to be the easiest thing to give away that anybody who's interested or willing. I mean, the person has to be willing to say, well, I'm willing to close my eyes too. I mean, I can close my eyes and do a closed eyes, leaves on a stream, or some of the more fun ones. But anyone who can pick up a pencil and draw and talk about the values highway, or talk about some of my, like the shield of armor, like how all of us are carrying around a shield, and you can have your clients, draw And a lot of these folks are working with kids with disabilities, kids without disabilities. Those kids that I worked with for that summer, they loved drawing the castle, because I was like, what's in your moat? What have you got protecting? What's in your castle? And I had them draw, their highway of life, their values, and what were their exits, the things that were getting in their way. They loved it. They dug it. So anyone could do it. It's just a willingness on the part of the group, I guess, the others, to be willing to say, oh, well, this isn't just some hokey psychobabble. This is something that could work. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. 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 Sure. I agree. I agree. I still think, though, there's that barrier that if there are a lot of folks in our field, and Steve knows this well. They don't even understand what contingency management, or they don't understand. And so people who don't come from Reno, trying to get them to bridge the gap to a traditional behavior analysis group of folks is very difficult, because if you don't understand the language, neither parties are going to be able to talk to each other. And so that's where the core issue is. I think anyone coming from our program could at least have some semi-coherent conversation about how to help a client. But how do you not come from Reno and do it? I think that's more what Steve's saying. And uh, it, as Steve always, says, we got to make it, pretty sexy in his words. I don't know how we make it appealing to you BA folks. How are we sexy? It's not that exciting. It's exciting in a different way. But that's really what we're talking about here. Not just us, but how to get it interesting. And how to get other clinical psychologists on board as well, to even want to talk to you folks, really, because they're going to want to come kind of in a top-down, really cognitive way about, well, let's go and we're going to do some thought stopping or whatever, and then maybe someone coming from a BA approach is going to say, no, that's really not going to work because this is maintained by attention seeking or whatever, and so thought stopping is really going to do zero and might intermittently or somehow reinforce the behavior, negatively reinforce. Anyway, you know what I'm saying. You and I can have that discussion, but somebody not from Reno, I don't know. So I think Steve's question is a good one. I'm actually going to do some thinking about it. Sure. I don't think so. I wanted to make sure that I addressed all the students' questions. I think one of the questions didn't get addressed that I think is an interesting one. Jessica asked a question about individuals with developmental disabilities needing to self-advocate because they're at increased risk for abuse. And she asked, do you find trauma or traumatic symptomology to be a common problem, and what part could ACT play in further preventing this? And I said, you know, my answer on that is that yes, but different types of trauma than what I might see in the normally distributed population, but not so much different that you might really think. It's very much the same, and I do think that the whole ACT vibe of focusing on values and who you want to be about, and being emotionally vulnerable, and understanding yourself, and understanding this sense of self as context as an individual who the person that you've been since the beginning, that you can remember, that gives a sense of peace. And what I've found with individuals suffering from any sort of trauma, whether they're in this population or not, once they really seem to, I'm going to say, get with a little g, self as context, there is a true sense of peace. And so I didn't want that to go unmentioned. I think that there's a piece that's offered there, and I that sense of like, there's a piece of me that's always been there, out, you know, looking out through these eyes from the beginning till now, and there's a thread pulled through the life. And I think some people feel that their life is sort of a patchwork quilt, and there's no continuity. And I think that for people with disabilities, maybe this is the first time they've contemplated that. And for people without disabilities, maybe they've contemplated it, but they have a lot of self-judgments about it. And so, well, you know, I suck, you know, I've turned my back on myself, so to speak. But if you can really get that self as context, that no, you've been there and you're there, and there's this line pulled through, it's this stitching through, and there's a sense of peace. So I wanted to make sure we address that question. Right. Absolutely. No, I completely. Well, it's yeah, and I'm actually thinking about what you just said is interesting because I was told during supervision during my internship, my supervisor said about maybe 3 months in, he said, I don't know how you get away with all that spiritual talk. There's not like one session you go through without some kind of there's God here and Buddha here and whatever. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, how do you get away? You're not. He said, I don't. He's not coming from an ACT tradition, and he said, I never talk about God or spirituality. I mean, never. He said, how do you get away with that? And I said, get away with it? What do you mean? He said, like, but you talk. I mean, he said, I've listened to tape after tape, and every single one of your sessions, he said, I just have to ask you, why? And I said, well, because this is what's motivating people. This is where their values are. And, everyone has some sense of spiritual core. And these are folks coming back from war, and all of them are impacted by thinking about who they want to be as a human being, who they were as a human being. I mean, being from the ACT community, you spend every day in your own world thinking about these things. It overlaps with clients. I mean, I don't, as you know, I mean, I even, I have art, I've written on it. I mean, I'm very interested in this in terms of my own personal life. It's meant a great deal to me to be through the ACT tradition. And I didn't see it as getting away with it. And with my intellectually challenged folks, they're some of the most, in fact, I was just talking about this with my partner the other day. I was like, some of those folks were some of the most religious folks I've ever met in my life. They were so loving and giving and caring about going to church every week, and they just were there and praying away and giving their hearts to God. And I went to 4 separate baptisms when I worked at Rural Regional Center. I was present at 3 weddings, and I went to, because you're part of the rural case management team and you go, people were being baptized right and left, and it's a huge part of, I mean, it's a big part of my therapeutic stance. Thank you. Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity. I enjoyed it. Thanks, guys. Bye.